Good afternoon. Today I want to review the issue of fundamental rights the way I've discussed it in the past, particularly the way I presented it online around 2004 and 2005. And I'll open with a picture of the Constitution Center in Philadelphia that I visited in early July of 2015, and there it is. Just wanted to show you that. Um, and somehow the So let me bring up sort of the index here. I have on one of my sites that's now the site under my legal name. I have a list of the panels that I had developed apparently around 2004 is the best I can tell when I had put them up on the Do Ask Do Tell site in the feature. And I want to run through some of the definitions and the concepts the way I've defined them in the past. Then the next video we'll talk about what happens when there are external problems or when there are social justice problems, equity problems, privilege, all of these kinds of things, as well as when there are things like pandemics and war and climate change and so forth. So um, there are about 10 panels or so here that I had put up then. And I had one which was where I talked about what a fundamental right is in my original way of thinking was as is something that's either specified in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or other amendments to the Constitution of the United States, or it's fully understood as essential to liberty in history and tradition, and it's normally supported by what we call substantive due process, which means that the government will recognize fundamental rights and is essentially being fair and will not interfere with them except when there is strict or heightened scrutiny because of some very serious state interest. Now, for example, a pandemic might create a state interest, might cause an increase in scrutiny level, for example, like public health or something. And then rational basis review, ordinary personal liberty interests are not recognized as fundamental if the government has a reasonably rational reason for restricting conduct that is maybe not as compelling as it is for strict scrutiny. An example might, in my opinion, might be restrooms and a person's original biological sex, laws like that, which a lot of people don't like to hear, but that might be something that would fall under rational basis review, would be my guess. But let's go on with the other panels. And I listed here the kinds of rights which are original rights, as I call them, fundamental rights, social rights, family rights, collective rights, and expressive rights. And we'll run down through some of these. An original right is clearly spelled out in the Constitution or in one of the amendments. And that might include the 14th Amendment and might include applying it to the states under incorporation doctrine, for example. And here are some examples of original rights. Those are like, well, not having to bear quarters or soldiers. That's the Third Amendment. That's very rarely comes up, although that was recently mentioned in contact with something. Unreasonable search and seizure, maybe, I don't know, civil asset forfeiture could come into their play there. Due process of law, both procedural and substantive. The due process, which of course became such an issue in 2022 with Alito. Writ of habeas corpus, no ex post facto law. I don't know, undoing a right, something that was legal before and then isn't legal now, like in a few states with affirmative care, that might be an issue. Involuntary servitude, well, that might be, that might have to do with conscription, for example, or male-only conscription, although the court said male-only conscription was constitutional back in 1981. Equal protection of the law, that kind of thing. So those are the examples of original rights. A fundamental right is an original right that is also or something that is well established by long cultural or judicial tradition, and that would normally, to abrogate it, would require substantive due process or strict scrutiny. Now, maybe a fundamental right wouldn't be completely protected, to go where you want, your freedom of movement, for example, might not be completely protected during a pandemic, as we found out with COVID. For example, here I would also mention that there are some videos that I made, I think it was January 29th, 2020, and I'll have them in the playlist, where I talked about fundamental rights, and I talked about the idea of a justification clause and of an operations clause in order to claim a fundamental right, and in conjunction particularly with the Second Amendment and with the right to bear arms. I think in D.C. versus Heller in 2008, the court said that it was the operations clause that really matters, even though the justification clause gets more into areas like perhaps areas having to do with identity and sexuality and so forth that have been, having a lot to do with social justice in recent years. But I did talk about those in early 2020 and January 29th, ironically just before the pandemic got a lot worse, and right after I'd been down to Richmond to an MLK Day for a big Second Amendment event. Examples of fundamental rights, well, they're pretty much the same as the others, but a little more having to do with privacy in your own home with consenting adults, for example. Well, that's been over, Lawrence versus Texas in 2003. Again, substantive due process, and there's questions about that according, with Alito and that opinion, and early in June of 2022 that was leaked by Politico about the future of substantive due process. It's something I would be concerned about. A social right is a purported right that requires a government setup of the facility to exercise the right, particularly normally with taxes and public infrastructure. And we think of public education. In most of the world, it includes universal health care, but not so much in the United States as we know. Elder care would be interesting because that could imply operationally responsibilities for filial responsibility for children. But there are subsidies for parents and families in many countries, and voting is something that has to be set up. Very controversial, especially in 2020. Some writers call these affirmative rights. I lost I backed out of it accidentally. Let's see if I can bring it back up. I'm going to have to stop the video here because I can't bring it back, and we'll resume it in just a minute with a part 2, because I can't bring it, the Camtasia's in the way, so we'll resume it in a part 2.